At my granddaughter's wedding, I realized I wasn't a guest. I was a label. I noticed it the moment the young woman at the check-in table handed me my name tag, her smile bright, unaware, innocent in a way that almost made me feel sorry for her. The card was thick, cream-colored, elegant, with gold lettering that shimmered under the chandelier light of the ballroom entrance. I expected to see something simple. Margaret Collins, grandmother of the bride. Maybe even a small heart or a tasteful flourish. Instead, the words stared back at me like a quiet accusation. The old lady who's paying for everything. My fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the card, just enough to crease it. Not enough for anyone to notice. Not enough to break the illusion. I felt the air shift around me, though no one had said a word yet. I could already sense it, the glances that would follow, the subtle smiles, the whispers that wouldn't quite reach my ears but would echo just the same. I lifted my head, straightened my shoulders, and pinned the tag neatly onto my pale blue dress, the one my late husband used to say made me look timeless. For a brief second, I caught my reflection in the glass door beside me. Silver hair, carefully styled. Soft makeup. Calm eyes. I looked exactly like a woman who had everything under control. And that was exactly what they needed to believe. I stepped into the ballroom. The space was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen rain. Tables dressed in white linen stretched across the room, and soft violin music floated through the air. Everything was perfect. Or at least, it looked that way. Guests turned as I walked in, their eyes flickering down for just a second longer than politeness required. Some smiled. Some looked away too quickly. One woman leaned toward her companion, whispering something behind a manicured hand, her lips curling just slightly at the edges. I didn't need to hear the words. I already knew. I moved gracefully through the room, nodding politely, accepting compliments about the wedding, about how beautiful everything was. "You must be so proud," someone said. I smiled. Of course I was. That part wasn't a lie. But pride has a strange way of changing shape when it's dressed up like this. As I reached my table, I noticed my son, standing across the room. Richard. He was laughing, a glass of champagne in his hand, his arm loosely draped around Pamela. She looked radiant, poised, completely at ease, as if every detail of this day had unfolded exactly as she intended. For a moment, our eyes met. Just a moment. Long enough for him to see me. Long enough for him to notice the name tag. And then, just as quickly, he looked away. Not shocked. Not confused. Just aware. That was when everything settled into place, quiet and precise, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking where it had always belonged. I understood then. This wasn't a joke. It wasn't a mistake. It was a message. And I smiled. Because they thought I wouldn't understand it. I sat down at my assigned table and gently smoothed the fabric of my dress, as if that small gesture could settle the quiet storm inside me. The place setting in front of me was immaculate. Polished silverware aligned perfectly beside a folded linen napkin, a crystal glass catching the soft glow of the chandelier above. Everything was arranged with care, with precision, with money. My money. I rested my hands lightly on the table and let my eyes drift across the room, taking in every detail I had paid for, every flower arrangement, every carefully chosen centerpiece, every chair covered in ivory satin. It was beautiful. There was no denying that. But beauty, I had learned over the years, could be a very effective disguise. A young couple passed behind me, their voices low but not low enough. "That is her," the woman whispered, and I felt rather than saw her glance fall to my chest. "The one who funded all of this." There was a small pause, followed by a soft laugh that was meant to be polite, but carried something sharper underneath. I did not turn around. I did not react. Instead, I reached for my water glass and took a slow sip, letting the coolness steady me. Across the table, an older gentleman cleared his throat and offered me a courteous smile, the kind that pretends not to notice what is plainly visible. "It is a lovely event," he said. I met his eyes and nodded. "Yes," I replied calmly. "It is exactly what they wanted." And that was the truth. Every detail had been chosen to meet their expectations, their standards, their vision of what a perfect day should look like. I had written the checks. I had asked no questions. I had believed that generosity, when given quietly, would be met with respect. That belief felt almost naive now, like something from a younger version of myself I barely recognized. The music shifted slightly as guests began to take their seats, the gentle hum of conversation rising and falling like a tide. I noticed how easily Pamela moved through the room, greeting guests, accepting compliments, her smile effortless and controlled. She paused near a group of women who admired the floral arrangements, and I watched as she leaned in just enough to be heard, her hand gesturing gracefully toward the centerpieces. I did not need to hear her words to understand the performance. She was presenting the day as hers. Her vision, her execution, her success, and perhaps, in her mind, it was. My contribution had been reduced to a quiet line on a name tag. A label. Something to be acknowledged with a smirk, not gratitude. I turned my gaze again toward my son. Richard was still standing near the bar, his posture relaxed, his laughter easy, as if nothing about this evening carried any weight at all. I studied his face, searching for something familiar, something that belonged to the boy who used to hold my hand in crowded places, who once looked at me as if I were the center of his world. I did not find him. What I saw instead was a man who had learned to look past me, a man who had decided that silence was easier than conflict, that comfort was more valuable than truth. And perhaps that was the most painful realization of all. Not the words on the card, not the whispers, but the quiet understanding that this had not been done without his knowledge. I folded my hands together and allowed a small, composed smile to return to my face. Let them have their evening. Let them believe this was harmless. Because the more I watched, the more clearly I began to see it. This was not just about a name tag. This was about position, about control, about rewriting the story of who I was in this family. And the most interesting part was not what they had done. It was how certain they were that I would accept it. I noticed her before she noticed me. Pamela stood near the head table, her posture perfectly composed, her smile calibrated for every guest who approached. She had always been good at that, adjusting her tone, her expression, her warmth depending on who was watching. It was a skill I used to admire. Now, I understood it differently. It was not warmth. It was strategy. I remained seated, observing the way she leaned slightly toward a group of guests, lowering her voice just enough to draw them in. One of the women laughed, a soft, knowing sound, and I caught a single sentence carried across the space between us. Well, you know how it is. Some people prefer to contribute instead of participate. The pause that followed was brief, but deliberate. It was not what she said. It was what she chose not to say. The implication hung in the air, subtle but unmistakable. I let my gaze drop to the table in front of me, tracing the edge of my napkin with my fingertips, as if the conversation had not reached me at all. But I heard enough. I always did. That had been my role for years. To notice, to understand, to remain silent. A server approached and gently placed a small appetizer in front of me, something delicate arranged with care, a detail meant to impress. I thanked him quietly and glanced around the room again. Everywhere I looked, there were signs of careful planning. Personalized menus, custom lighting, a string quartet positioned near the far wall, their music filling the space with something soft and elegant. Every element spoke of intention. Nothing here had been accidental. That thought settled in slowly, like something inevitable. Across the room, Richard finally began moving in my direction. His steps were unhurried, his expression neutral, but there was a slight tension in the way his shoulders held, a stiffness that had not been there earlier. He stopped a few feet from me, as if unsure whether to come closer or keep his distance. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. "Mom," he said, offering a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Everything looks good, right?" It was a simple question, harmless on the surface, but I heard what he was really asking. Are you going to say something? Are you going to make this difficult? I looked up at him, meeting his gaze with calm steadiness. "It is beautiful," I said. And again, that was the truth. Beauty had never been the problem. He nodded quickly, relief flickering across his face before he masked it again. "Good," he replied. "I am glad you like it." He hesitated, his eyes briefly flicking downward toward my name tag before returning to my face. There was a moment there, a chance, a space where he could have said something, explained, apologized, acknowledged. He did none of those things. Instead, he gave a short, polite nod and stepped back. "I should get back," he added, already turning away before I could respond. And just like that, the moment passed. I watched him walk back toward Pamela, watched as she reached for his arm with practiced ease, guiding him into another conversation as if nothing in the world required explanation. I sat there for a few seconds longer, letting the silence settle around me. Then I leaned back slightly in my chair and exhaled, slow and steady. It was clearer now than it had been before. Not just what they had done, but how long it had been building. This was not a single decision made in poor taste. It was the result of many small choices, layered carefully over time, each one shifting my place just a little further to the side. And I had allowed it. Not out of weakness, but out of trust. That trust felt different now. Not broken, just misplaced. I reached for my glass again, watching the light catch along its edge, and a quiet thought settled into place with surprising clarity. They believed this was the extent of their control. They believed this was the story they could define. And that belief, more than anything else, was where they had made their first real mistake. The first course was cleared quietly, plates lifted and replaced with practiced efficiency, as if nothing in the room could ever be out of place for more than a moment. I watched the rhythm of it, the way each detail was managed, adjusted, corrected before anyone could notice a flaw. It reminded me of how things used to be in my own home, years ago, when I still believed that if I kept everything running smoothly, no one would ever have a reason to be dissatisfied. That belief had guided me through decades of decisions, through sacrifices that no one had asked for out loud, but had come to expect all the same. I rested my hands in my lap and let my thoughts move backward, not in a rush, but in quiet sequence. I remembered the first time Pamela walked into our lives, her smile warm, her voice respectful, her presence carefully measured. She had known exactly how to position herself then. Attentive, grateful, willing to learn. I had welcomed her without hesitation. I had shown her where everything was, how we did things, what mattered to our family. I had believed she wanted to be part of it. And for a while, it seemed like she did. Small changes came slowly, almost invisibly. A suggestion here, a preference there, a different way of celebrating holidays, a different schedule for visits. None of it felt significant on its own, not enough to question, not enough to resist. But over time, those small changes formed a pattern, and that pattern shifted the center of everything I had built. I remembered the first holiday I spent alone because they had decided to travel instead. The first time Richard told me it would be easier if I called ahead before visiting. The first time I noticed that decisions were being made without including me, even when they directly involved things I had contributed to. Each moment had seemed minor at the time. Temporary. Understandable. I had told myself that families evolve, that roles change, that letting go was part of growing older. And perhaps that was true. But what I had not recognized then was how consistently those changes moved in one direction. Away from me. A soft clink of glass pulled me back to the present. Someone nearby raised a toast. Laughter followed, and the room brightened with applause. I turned slightly in my chair and watched as Pamela stood near the center, accepting the attention with that same composed grace. She thanked everyone for coming, her voice carrying clearly across the room, polished and confident. She spoke about family, about support, about how much it meant to have everyone there to celebrate together. I listened carefully to every word. It was all perfectly said, thoughtful, appropriate, complete, and not once did she look in my direction. Not once did she acknowledge where any of it had come from. That absence was not an oversight. It was a decision. I felt something settle inside me then, not sharp, not overwhelming, but steady, like a line being drawn with quiet certainty. I had spent years giving without needing recognition. I had believed that what mattered was the outcome, not the credit. But sitting there now, surrounded by everything I had made possible, reduced to a single line on a card, I finally understood the difference between generosity and erasure. I was not being overlooked. I was being rewritten. And the most remarkable part was how carefully it had been done, how gradually, how deliberately, until even I had almost accepted it as normal. I lifted my chin slightly and allowed my gaze to move across the room one more time, taking in every detail, every face, every carefully constructed moment. They had built a beautiful narrative here tonight, one where I existed only as a footnote, one where my role had been simplified, contained, and labeled for convenience. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider a different possibility. Not how I had been placed in their story, but how easily that story could change. It was a quiet voice that reached me, not loud enough to draw attention, but steady enough to cut through everything else. Mrs. Collins. I turned slightly and found a familiar face standing just behind my chair. Martin Reynolds. He had aged, of course, as we all had, but there was something unchanged in his posture, in the way he carried himself with a kind of quiet precision. He gave me a small nod, respectful, measured. I was hoping I might find you here, he said. I gestured gently to the empty chair beside me, and he took it without hesitation, setting a slim leather folder on the table in front of him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply observed the room together, the movement, the light, the carefully constructed atmosphere of celebration. Then his gaze shifted, just briefly, toward my name tag. I saw the moment he registered it. The slight tightening around his eyes. The pause before he looked back at me. I see they have been creative, he said quietly. There was no humor in his voice. I allowed a small smile, one that did not quite reach my eyes. It is a memorable touch, I replied. He studied me for a second longer, as if assessing something beneath the surface. Then he leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to remain private. Your husband anticipated many things, he said. But I do not think he anticipated this. The mention of my husband did not bring the sharp ache it once had. Instead, it brought clarity, structure, a reminder of the way things had been arranged with intention, not assumption. He believed in preparation, I said softly. Martin nodded. He did, which is why I am here. He placed his hand lightly on the folder, but did not open it yet. There is a provision that we discussed years ago. One he insisted remained dormant unless it became necessary. I did not reach for the folder. I did not need to. I already understood what he was telling me. Not the specifics, but the direction, the existence of something more, something they did not know about. Around us, the room continued as if nothing had changed. Laughter rose from a nearby table. Glasses clinked. Music filled the air with something soft and polished. And yet, in that small space between Martin and me, everything had shifted. He wanted them to value you for who you are, Martin continued. Not for what you provide. I let that settle. Not as a comfort, but as a fact. And if they did not? I asked quietly. Martin's expression did not change, but there was a firmness in his tone when he answered. Then the structure changes. Simple words. Precise. Final. I glanced once more across the room, toward Richard and Pamela, toward the carefully orchestrated image they were presenting to everyone around them. They looked confident, certain, untouchable. It was almost impressive, the way they carried it. Almost. I turned back to Martin and gave a slight nod. Thank you for coming, I said. He inclined his head in return, understanding that no further explanation was needed in that moment. The folder remained closed between us, but its presence was enough. It did not need to be opened yet. Not here. Not now. I rested my hands lightly on the table again, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in the quiet certainty that had begun to take shape. They believed this evening was complete, that every detail had been accounted for, that every role had been assigned. But what they had not considered was the one element they could not control. Not the flowers, not the lighting, not the narrative they had built so carefully. They had not accounted for what happens when the person they have underestimated finally decides to step out of the role they were given. I did not open the folder. Not yet. Instead, I let my hand rest lightly beside it, as if it were nothing more than another detail among many, something that did not require immediate attention. Timing, I had learned, was rarely about speed. It was about precision. Around me, the evening continued to unfold exactly as they had planned. The second course arrived, servers moving in quiet synchronization, placing plates in front of each guest with practiced grace. Conversations resumed, laughter rising and falling in soft waves. The room alive with the kind of energy that comes from people who believe they are exactly where they are meant to be. I picked up my fork and tasted the food, noting its quality, its presentation, the careful balance of flavors. It was excellent. Of course it was. Nothing here had been left to chance. I set the fork down again after a few bites, my appetite not absent, but redirected. Across the room, Pamela stood near the center once more, speaking with a group of guests who seemed entirely captivated by her. She moved effortlessly, her gestures controlled, her voice likely warm and confident. I watched the way people responded to her, the way they leaned in, the way they mirrored her expressions, as if she were setting the tone for the entire evening. Influence, I thought, is often mistaken for presence. She had cultivated it well. Richard stood just behind her, slightly to the side, his role less defined but no less telling. He nodded at the right moments, smiled when expected, and remained comfortably within the space she created. It was a dynamic I recognized now with a clarity I had not allowed myself before. He had not been pushed aside. He had stepped aside. There is a difference. I let my gaze drift away from them and back to the table, to the folder that remained closed, patient. I could feel its weight without touching it again, not physical, but symbolic. It represented something they had overlooked. Not because it was hidden, but because they had assumed it would never matter. Assumptions, I reflected, are often the quietest mistakes. A voice from my left pulled me gently back. Margaret, everything is just stunning, is it not? It was a woman I recognized from years ago, someone who had attended more than one of our family gatherings. Her tone was polite, but there was a subtle curiosity beneath it, the kind that seeks confirmation without asking directly. I turned to her with a calm expression. It is very well done, I replied. She glanced briefly at my name tag, then back at me, her smile tightening just slightly. You must be very generous, she said. The word lingered in the air, carefully chosen. I held her gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod. Generosity is easy, I said evenly. Understanding its value is not. She blinked, as if unsure how to respond, then offered a quick smile and turned her attention elsewhere. I did not watch her leave. I did not need to. Instead, I sat back in my chair and allowed myself a moment of stillness. Not hesitation, not doubt, just stillness. The kind that comes before a decision has fully formed, when everything aligns quietly beneath the surface. I looked once more across the room, taking in the details I had already memorized. The lighting, the arrangement, the faces, the confidence. They believed this evening belonged to them. That every element, every narrative, every perception was theirs to control. And for now it did. I had no intention of interrupting it prematurely. Let them continue. Let them build it higher. Let them settle into the certainty they had created. Because certainty, when it is built on incomplete understanding, has a way of collapsing all at once. I reached for my glass again, taking a slow, measured sip, and allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch my lips. Not because anything had changed yet, but because I finally understood exactly when it would. The room shifted subtly as the evening moved toward its next phase, the soft music lowering just enough for voices to rise, for attention to gather in a more focused way. I recognized the transition immediately. This was the moment they had been building toward. Speeches, acknowledgments, carefully chosen words designed to shape how this night would be remembered. I sat a little straighter in my chair, not out of anticipation, but out of awareness. Timing, once again. It always revealed more than intention ever could. Pamela stepped forward first, a glass in her hand, her posture flawless, her expression warm in that practiced, effortless way. The room responded instantly. Conversations quieted. Heads turned. Attention settled where she wanted it. I watched as she took her place, her gaze sweeping across the guests, pausing just long enough to make each person feel included. It was a performance, yes, but a refined one. Thank you all for being here, she began, her voice clear, confident, carrying easily across the room. She spoke about love, about family, about the importance of support and unity. Every word was carefully chosen, every pause deliberate. She thanked friends, colleagues, distant relatives. She spoke of effort, of planning, of how meaningful it was to bring everyone together for such a special occasion. I listened closely, not for what she said, but for what she omitted. It did not take long. There was no mention of me, not even a passing acknowledgement, not a glance in my direction. It was as if I did not exist within the narrative she was presenting, as if everything that had made this evening possible had simply appeared on its own. A few guests glanced briefly toward my table, then quickly looked away again, unsure whether to notice or ignore the absence. I remained still, my expression calm, my posture unchanged. This, too, was information. When she finished, the room responded with warm applause, the kind that confirms a story people are comfortable believing. Pamela smiled, graceful, satisfied, and stepped back, her role completed exactly as she had intended. Then Richard took the glass. For a moment, something in me paused. Not expectation, not hope, just a quiet curiosity. He cleared his throat, his voice slightly less steady than hers, but still composed. He spoke about his daughter, about pride, about watching her grow into the person she had become. His words were sincere, at least in part. There was truth in them. But sincerity can exist alongside omission, and omission, I had learned, often speaks louder than anything else. He, too, thanked those who had contributed to the day. Vendors, organizers, friends who had helped coordinate details. His list was thorough, impressive even, and once again, I was not part of it. Not by accident, not by oversight, by choice. I felt something settle fully into place then, not with force, but with clarity. This was the moment. Not the one where I would act. Not yet. But the one where everything became undeniable. I reached for the folder beside me, my fingers resting lightly on its surface for the first time since Martin had placed it there. I did not open it. I did not need to. Its presence alone was enough to remind me that there was another version of this story. One they had not considered. One they had not prepared for. The applause faded. Conversation began to rise again, and the evening continued as if nothing of consequence had occurred. But I knew better now. I had seen enough, heard enough, understood enough. And as I sat there, surrounded by the illusion they had built so carefully, I realized something simple and absolute. They had just finished telling their version of the story. And soon, whether they expected it or not, it would be my turn. I did not rush. That was the first decision I made. While the room slowly returned to its comfortable rhythm, I remained seated for a few seconds longer, allowing the moment to breathe, allowing their version of the evening to settle into place exactly as they intended. Then, without drawing attention to myself, I reached for the folder and lifted it from the table. The motion was simple, unremarkable, and yet, I felt the shift immediately, not in the room, but within myself. I stood. My chair moved back with a soft sound against the floor, just enough to turn a few heads nearby. Not many. Not yet. I took a step forward, then another, moving toward the center of the room with the same calm, measured pace I had carried all evening. No urgency, no hesitation, just presence. Conversations continued at first, overlapping voices filling the space, until I reached a point where I could see most of the room without turning my head. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask for attention. I simply waited. It is remarkable how silence works when you allow it to. One table quieted, then another, until the absence of sound spread naturally, like something people felt before they fully understood it. When enough eyes had turned in my direction, I gave a small, polite nod, acknowledging their attention as if it had been expected all along. I will not take much of your time, I said, my voice steady, clear, carrying just far enough without strain. There was a brief pause, the kind that invites curiosity rather than demands it. I held the folder lightly in my hands, not opening it yet. Tonight has been presented beautifully, I continued. Every detail carefully arranged. Every contribution acknowledged. I let that sentence settle, just long enough for its meaning to begin forming beneath the surface. A few guests shifted slightly in their seats. A subtle tension began to move through the room, quiet but unmistakable. I did not look at Pamela immediately. I did not look at Richard. I did not need to. However, I said calmly, there is one small detail that has been misunderstood. That was when I opened the folder. The sound of the clasp releasing was soft, but in that moment, it carried further than anything else had all evening. I removed a single document, holding it with the same care one might give to something both fragile and precise. Years ago, I continued, my husband made certain arrangements. Not out of suspicion, but out of clarity. He believed that respect within a family should not be assumed. It should be demonstrated. I glanced briefly toward Martin, who remained seated, his expression composed, his presence steady. Then I returned my attention to the room. Within those arrangements, there is a provision, I said. A simple one. Any individual who chooses to publicly diminish or misrepresent my role within this family forfeits any financial benefit connected to my estate, effective immediately. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense, alive with realization. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Tonight, I added gently, that provision has been activated. I closed the folder with the same quiet precision and lowered it to my side. No dramatic gesture. No emphasis. Just completion. Only then did I allow my gaze to move, briefly, toward Richard, then to Pamela. I did not hold their eyes. I did not need to see their reactions to understand them. Instead, I offered the room a small, composed smile, the kind one gives at the end of something properly concluded. And in that moment, without raising my voice, without accusing, without anger, the entire story they had built so carefully began to unravel on its own. No one spoke. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the expressions, not the shifting glances, not even the way the air itself seemed to tighten around the room. It was the silence. Complete, unbroken, and heavier than anything that had come before it. I let it remain. I did not fill it. I did not explain further. There was nothing left to clarify. The words had already done what they needed to do. I adjusted the folder in my hand slightly, a small, controlled movement, then stepped back from the center of the room. Not quickly, not hesitantly, simply with the same calm precision I had carried from the moment I walked in. As I moved, the room seemed to part in subtle ways, guests shifting just enough to create space without fully realizing they were doing so. A few faces turned toward me, some with curiosity, others with something closer to discomfort. I did not meet their eyes for long. I did not need their understanding. I had already reclaimed something far more important. Out of the corner of my vision, I saw Richard take a step forward, then stop, as if uncertain whether to follow or remain where he was. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Pamela, for the first time that evening, was no longer composed. Her posture had changed, just slightly, just enough to reveal that the control she had maintained so carefully was no longer entirely hers. But I did not pause. I did not turn back. I did not offer them a moment to respond, to explain, or to reshape what had already been made clear. Some things, once said, do not require discussion. I reached my table again, setting the folder down gently, aligning it with the edge as if placing it exactly where it belonged. Then I removed my name tag. The small pin released with a soft click, and I held the card between my fingers for a second, looking at the words once more. The label. The version of me they had chosen to present. Without any visible emotion, I placed it flat on the table, beside the folder, leaving it there as quietly as it had been given to me. A simple act, but final. I picked up my purse, smoothing the strap over my shoulder, and allowed myself one last glance across the room. The music had not resumed. Conversations had not recovered. The evening, for all its careful planning, had been interrupted in a way that could not be undone. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. I did not feel anger. I did not feel satisfaction. What I felt was something much steadier. Clarity. The kind that does not demand reaction, because it has already reached its conclusion. I turned and walked toward the exit, my steps measured, unhurried, each one carrying me further away from a version of myself that no longer existed. No one stopped me. No one called my name. And that, more than anything, confirmed what I already understood. Outside, the air was cool, the quiet of the night a stark contrast to the atmosphere I had just left behind. I paused for a brief moment, looking up at the dark sky, allowing the stillness to settle around me. Then I exhaled slowly and continued forward. Because I was never the woman they reduced to a line on a card. And I was never the one simply paying for everything. I was the one who had allowed them to believe that. And now, that belief was gone.